What's good, y'all? Let's talk about the critical race theory. The truth about the critical race theory. Today, I'm going to be telling you all the 5 principles of the critical race theory as presented by Derrick and multiple scholars who studied the critical race theory and taught the critical race theories. This is what is theoretically being taught in schools, and this isn't going to be a white man bad America racist. The main basis of the critical race theory is that race is a social construct. The social construction of race is the ideal that race is not grounded in biology. The earliest mentions of race in literature comes from the 15th century, and it was used to define group affiliations, lineage, or ancestry. Well, once upon a time, there was a lot of work to be done in America. Therefore, we had indentured servants. However, indentured servants were under contract. So yes, it was cheap work and almost free labor, basically free labor. Their contract would eventually end, and they would go on to build homes and build properties and build wealth. Slaves, on the other hand, had no contract. That means they would be slaves, their children would be slaves, their grandchildren would be slaves, and there was no way out. Therefore, they had to justify this mistreatment of the African people. So when you think about racism today, you probably think of the most commonly accepted definition of racism, which is prejudice or discrimination against somebody of a different racial or ethnic group. However, that's not how the critical race theory sees race or racism. They see it as the justification of social inequality based on the construct of race. Now, this definition of race is a little bit more accurate, especially when you think of Judaism. Judaism is a religion. It's not even based on any immutable characteristics. However, Nazi Germany was able to create a social structure of race based off of this trait. The reason being is because race has absolutely nothing to do with the trait on which the racial structure is created around. The second tenet of critical race theory is interest convergence. Interest convergence says that the interest of black people to achieve racial equality won't be achieved until white people gain that interest as well. Now, for some people, they may interpret this as blame whitey. Black people just sit around and wait for white people to solve all their problems. But in fact, if we just look at history, that's not how it has happened. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X didn't just sit around and wait for whitey. They went out and they marched and they gained support. It wasn't until those in power gained the interest in changing the laws that laws got changed. My favorite example of this is actually Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln said that he was perfectly happy with white people holding the position of superiority over black people. But then you had actual abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. You had people like Harriet Tubman freeing all the slaves, causing conflict. Then that conflict stirred up into a war against the North and the South. And Abraham Lincoln said, if I could end all of this without freeing the slaves, I absolutely would. But it was in his best interest to free the slaves, which was the same interest of the slaves. A better, more current example would be former President Trump. Former President Trump told a bunch of police, you can take the hand away. He told them, don't be too nice. Then, regardless of how you feel about Black Lives Matter, they came out and made some noise, and their focus was police brutality against black people. Former President Trump had absolutely no interest in solving that problem until after BLM gained the national attention. Then it came to his election year, and all of a sudden he signs an executive order telling police to be a little bit nicer because his interests had changed. That is the basis of interest convergence. The tenet that we're going to talk about today is the idea that racism is normal. It's something that we can see in so many statistics even today. Black people who need organs find them about 26% of the time, as compared to white people who need organs who find them about 48% of the time. 1% of scholarships are earmarked for African Americans, and yet white people still take 70% of all scholarships. Black people are stopped more often by the police. Black people get more years for similar crimes as white people. I just did a video about how black people's homes were devalued. So all of these statistics will prove that racism was normal if all of these statistics had something to do with race. However, many people will argue that there are other factors besides racism creating these disparities in all of these categories. One of the main issues that always comes up is the statistic that 13% of the population commit 50% of the crime. But let's get into that. Because me, as a black man, I'm not a criminal. I wear my pants up. I dress nice. I'm professional, courteous, and yet I could move into the nicest neighborhood with the cleanest record, and my home would still be subject to being devalued by 23% statistically because of my race. And when being presented with these statistics, a lot of people have said that it's understandable because 13% of the population commit 50% of the crime. The same thing was happening then that's happening now, where you had redlining, which literally devalued black homes for no other reason except for the race, and it was written into law. We would agree today that of course that was racist, and yet the same thing's happening right now and it's somehow not racist because you're justifying it with another statistic. And it's causing disparities not just in these categories but in schools, jobs, families. I could pull up hundreds of statistics by race where African Americans are disparaged, and it's quite amazing how people could look at all of those statistics and still say that it has absolutely nothing to do with racism. That just shows just how normal racism is. The fourth tenet is storytelling and counter storytelling. You can see perspective and viewpoint play out a lot of times in the media, especially today when it comes to left-wing politics and right-wing politics. Over the summer, it was hard to see what protests were peaceful and what protests were riot. Fox News wasn't reporting on the peaceful protests, and CNN wasn't reporting on the riots. However, it also happens when it comes to African Americans and white people. This is an article from 2005 about Hurricane Katrina. The first article from the Associated Press is about a black man. A young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store. So, the black man looted a grocery store. This other article is about two white people. Two residents wade through the chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. As you can see, the way you tell the story can change the perspective. The final tenet of critical race theory is that white people are the recipients of civil rights. Now, granted, a lot of the issues with civil rights programs such as affirmative actions, a lot of the issues that existed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of those have been solved. However, there is still an ideal that white people actually do benefit from civil rights. One of the best examples I can think of this is Obama became president, so the ideal of racism is over. Basically, you have 400 years of slavery, 400 years of injustice. Socially setting everybody equal without bridging the wealth gap will mean that the wealth gap statistically will never be closed. I hope you all learned something about what the critical race theory actually is. Whether you still disagree with it, at very least you know actual facts about the theory. So, if you like this video, don't forget, like, share, comment, and subscribe, all that fun stuff. Please help this video in particular rank. When making this video, it was very hard for me to find any other video that actually taught the truth about the critical race theory. Anyways, here's the question. If you disagree with the critical race theory, do you agree with anything I said? And if you agree with the critical race theory, did you find my information to be accurate? And finally, if you've never heard about the critical race theory, did you learn something today? Let's talk about it.